Most people dismissed it as static, but Ranger's growl told a different story. What he heard in that radio wasn't noise, it was a child's cry for help. The night was quiet in the Oak Ridge police station, the kind of quiet that made every tick of the wall clock sound louder than it should. The computers hummed, the fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the dispatch radios gave off their usual static bursts, nothing more than background noise to most people. Claire sat at her desk, her head resting in her hand, a half-empty mug of cold coffee pushed to the side. Her partner, Ranger, a scarred but proud German shepherd, lay stretched across the floor with his chin on his paws, eyes half closed, but never fully asleep. He had the look of a dog who could rest in stillness, but would be ready to move at the first sound that mattered. At first the sound was nothing, just another faint burst of static from a forgotten frequency. The dispatch officer barely looked up. Claire was used to the interference too. She had heard it all her career. But Ranger's ears snapped forward so fast the metal tag on his collar jingled. He lifted his head, amber eyes narrowing, and a low rumble started in his chest. His body stiffened, muscles tense, as if he had just caught a scent in the air that no one else could detect. Claire glanced at him, then at the monitor, then back at him. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice half amused. The radio crackled again, this time longer, almost like a voice trying to break through the veil of static. Claire leaned in and adjusted the dial. Nothing but fuzz. She shook her head. "Just interference," she muttered. But Ranger did not relax. He stood up, paws clicking against the tile floor, and pressed his nose against the radio unit like he was trying to crawl inside it. His growl deepened, not of fear but of certainty, like he knew something was hidden there waiting to be heard. Claire frowned and tried the dial again, twisting slowly, scanning through the band. The static rose and fell, until for a fraction of a second she thought she heard a word. It was faint, high-pitched, trembling, but then it was gone. She leaned closer, straining her ears, but all she caught was the echo of her own heartbeat and the low growl of the shepherd at her side. "You're imagining things," she whispered to herself. But Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, a sound that made the other officers down the hall glance up. The room felt different now, heavier somehow. Claire tapped the desk nervously, unsure if she was chasing shadows or missing something important. Ranger pawed at her leg, then at the radio, then back again, his tail stiff like a wire. His message was clear. He had heard something she hadn't. He wasn't going to let it go. Claire sighed and picked up her notepad, scribbling down the frequency just in case. The static hissed once more, stretched thin across the wires like a whisper being pulled apart by distance. And then, hidden inside it, so faint it barely seemed real, came a sound that made Claire's breath catch in her throat. A voice, small, weak, calling out. Ranger's ears twitched, and his body went still. His eyes locked on hers, burning with a certainty that made her heart pound. Somewhere in the dark, someone was calling for help, and Ranger was not going to let the world ignore it. The basement was damp and smelled of mildew, the kind of smell that clung to skin and clothes and made breathing feel heavy. A single bulb hung from a wire above, flickering every so often, but most of the room was hidden in shadow. In the corner sat Lila, 12 years old, her knees pulled tight to her chest. Her lips were cracked, her hair matted with dirt, and her small hands trembled as she held the old radio she had found on a shelf. It wasn't much, its casing chipped and its antenna bent, but to her it was more precious than gold. It was her only chance. For days she had been twisting the knobs, pressing the buttons, whispering into the tiny microphone like a prayer. Sometimes the machine spat out nothing but harsh static. Sometimes it gave her a faint hum, and once she thought she even heard music, though it was so brief she wondered if she had imagined it. Tonight her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper, but still she tried. "Please, someone, help me," she said softly. leaning close to the radio. The speaker hissed back like a snake, cruel and empty. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against the cold metal. The silence in the basement pressed on her from all sides. She remembered her father's laugh, her mother's songs in the kitchen, the way her older brother teased her at dinner. Those memories felt far away now, slipping further each day. But she held on to them like she held on to the broken radio. Her stomach hurt from hunger, her throat burned from thirst. But she refused to stop trying. Someone had to hear her. Someone had to be listening. Her voice cracked as she tried again. "My name is Lila. I'm lost. Please." She tapped the microphone 3 times, a rhythm she had repeated over and over, hoping it might sound like more than static to someone out there. Then she sat still, waiting, her heart beating in her ears. For a long time there was nothing, just the endless hiss of the machine, cold and uncaring. Tears filled her eyes, and she let out a small sob she quickly smothered with her hand. She didn't want them to hear her, not the men upstairs. She had learned quickly not to make noise. Their voices carried through the cracks in the ceiling, deep and cruel, talking about things she did not understand but knew were dangerous. They came down sometimes with food she could barely eat, or to check if she was still alive. She never spoke to them, never gave them more than silence. But when they left, when the heavy boots stomped back up the stairs, she turned to the radio again. It was the only thing that made her feel less alone. That night, just as she was about to give up and curl into herself, she froze. From above came a sound she hadn't heard before. Not the men's voices, not their boots. Something lighter. A scrape, a shift, a noise like claws against wood. Her breath caught in her throat. She held the radio tighter and whispered into the dark, her voice small but full of desperate hope. "Is someone there?" The station was still half asleep when the faint signal came through again. Just another crackle of static that most dismissed without a thought. The radios were always filled with noise, hisses, and pops that came from nowhere, and no one wanted to waste time chasing ghosts. Claire leaned back in her chair, rubbing her eyes, the weight of long hours making her bones ache. Around her, a few officers laughed quietly over a late-night card game, their voices low and tired. No one paid attention to the faint sound on the desk, except Ranger. The German shepherd would not sit still. He paced the floor with his nails clicking against the tile, tail stiff, ears pricked toward the radio. Every few seconds he circled back, planting his paws against the edge of the desk, claws scraping as he tried to climb closer. His amber eyes burned into Claire like he was demanding her attention. She reached down to calm him, brushing her hand along his back, but his muscles were coiled tight, every line of his body tense. "It's nothing," she muttered. But even as she said it, she knew she didn't believe it. Ranger let out a low bark, sharp and insistent, the kind of bark that carried weight. He pressed his nose to the radio, then back to Claire, then to the radio again, repeating the movement like he was spelling out the message for her. She sighed, picked up the headset, and pressed it against her ear. At first, nothing but the familiar hiss of static filled her head. She adjusted the dial, turning slowly, and the sound shifted in waves. For a moment she thought it was just the machine playing tricks, but then she froze. Something faint, softer than a breath, slid between the cracks of noise. She leaned in closer, her pulse quickening. It was so quiet she wasn't sure at first, but then she heard it again, a voice, thin, trembling, carried on the weak current of the signal. She pressed the dial tighter, her other hand gripping the desk. "My name is Lila," the voice whispered, almost swallowed by the static. Claire's heart stuttered. She shot a glance at Ranger, who had gone perfectly still, ears locked on the sound. He had heard it too. She ripped the headset off and turned up the volume. The room filled with crackling noise, and the other officers groaned. "Turn that down, Claire, it's just interference," one called. She ignored them, her eyes fixed on the radio. "Say it again," she whispered under her breath. as though willing the voice to return. For a moment there was nothing, only empty static. Then, faintly, came 3 soft taps, a rhythm too steady to be an accident. Ranger barked again, louder this time, his tail thrashing. He pressed against Claire's legs as if pushing her to move, to act. The other officers shrugged and went back to their game. But Claire's stomach had gone cold. She knew what she had heard. A child. Someone reaching out, sending pieces of their fear into the void, hoping someone would notice. She placed her hand on Ranger's head, feeling the steady warmth of him beneath her palm. He wasn't going to let this go, and neither was she. Somewhere, a girl was calling, and tonight, they were the only ones listening. The night air was sharp and cold. As Claire stepped out of the station, her jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, the radio tucked under her arm. She hadn't even signed out or told the others where she was going. It didn't matter, because Ranger had already made the decision for her. The German Shepherd pulled hard on the leash, his muscles straining like a coiled spring, his paws hitting the pavement in quick, urgent strides. Claire had worked with him long enough to know when his instincts had taken over, when he was following something no human could see or hear. Tonight was one of those times. They crossed the parking lot, the glow of the station lights fading behind them. Ahead stretched the open fields that led into the edge of the woods. The grass was high and silvered by moonlight, swaying in the breeze. Claire's boots crunched over the dirt path, but Ranger didn't make a sound beyond the steady rhythm of his breathing. Every few feet he stopped suddenly, head cocked, ears flicking like radar dishes scanning the air. Then he would surge forward again, dragging her deeper into the night. Claire kept glancing at the radio, hearing only the faint hiss of static, but Ranger reacted like it was alive, like it was whispering only to him. When she tried to slow down, he barked, sharp and impatient, tugging at her hand until she stumbled forward again. All right, she muttered, her breath visible in the cold. I'm coming. They passed through the field until they reached the first line of utility poles. The wooden beams rose high into the dark sky, wires stretching like black veins across the stars. Claire might not have noticed anything, but Ranger froze beneath one of the poles. His ears pricked, his gaze fixed upward. A low growl rumbled in his throat, then rose into a mournful howl that echoed across the empty land. Claire shivered, goosebumps rising on her skin. The wires above gave off a faint hum, so soft she wouldn't have heard it if not for the silence around them. Ranger barked once, then turned sharply, nose to the ground, pulling her away from the path and into the rougher terrain. She tightened her grip on the leash, but let him lead. Each step seemed to carry them farther from safety, deeper into the shadows of the trees. Branches snapped underfoot as they entered the woods. Ranger stopped often, sniffing the air, tilting his head toward sounds only he could detect. Claire's nerves grew tighter with every pause, every flick of his ears. The radio hissed quietly, and once, just once, she thought she heard it again, a faint tap, like someone knocking from far away. She froze, her heart hammering. Ranger whined softly, then tugged at the leash, urging her forward. The deeper they went, the darker it became, the trees closing in on all sides. Claire swallowed her fear and pressed on, trusting the dog who had never once led her wrong. Ranger moved with certainty, his tail stiff, his nose low to the ground, his body guided by something she couldn't explain. He stopped again, lifting his head, and howled once more, the sound carrying through the woods like a call and an answer to some invisible voice. Somewhere ahead, beyond the trees and the shadows, the trail waited. Ranger had found it, and Claire knew they were no longer chasing static. They were chasing a child's cry for help. The woods grew thicker the farther they went, branches clawing at Claire's jacket, and roots grabbing at her boots. But Ranger never slowed. His breathing was steady, his movements sharp and focused, every muscle in his body straining forward, as if he could already see what she could not. The air was heavy with damp earth and the faint buzz of insects, the kind of silence that seemed to hold its breath before something was about to happen. Claire kept glancing at the radio, still tucked under her arm, though it had gone quiet except for the occasional hiss. Ranger didn't need it anymore. His body told her he was already locked on to something. After what felt like hours, though the moon hadn't moved far in the sky, they broke through a tangle of brush and found themselves in a clearing. At its center stood an old shack, sagging under the weight of time, its roof patched with rusted tin sheets, its windows covered with boards. At first it looked like nothing more than a forgotten hunting cabin, abandoned long ago, but then Claire noticed the wires. They stretched awkwardly from the roof, running into the trees like veins, twisted together with tape and metal clamps, and at the top was a strange antenna pieced together from scrap. Ranger stiffened beside her, a growl starting low in his throat. His ears pointed forward, his tail straight out behind him. Claire's hand went to the flashlight clipped to her belt. She switched it on and swept the beam across the shack. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and the steps leading up to it were soft with rot. She felt her stomach turn as she spotted something caught on a nail by the frame, a strip of faded fabric that looked like it had been torn from a sleeve. Ranger moved first, pulling her toward the shack with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. The floor creaked as they stepped inside, dust rising in the beam of her light. The air smelled of mold and old smoke. In one corner was a pile of empty cans, in another a mattress dark with stains. The radio antenna's wires ran down through the wall into the floor, disappearing beneath the boards. Ranger's growl deepened. He sniffed the floor, moving in tight circles, then stopped suddenly. His claws scraped as he began to dig at the wood, his teeth bared, his body quivering with determination. Claire knelt beside him, shining her light where he scratched. At first, she saw nothing but warped boards, but then her fingers found a line, a seam cut into the floor. She traced it with her hand, her heart thudding harder with each inch. It wasn't just a floor, it was a cover. Ranger barked, sharp and certain, then tore at the wood again until splinters scattered across the room. Claire dropped to her knees and pulled at the boards with him. Slowly, painfully, they lifted one free, and beneath it, hidden in the dark, was a metal handle. She froze, her light catching on it, dust swirling in the air. A trapdoor. Ranger stood over it, teeth bared, chest heaving, his eyes blazing like he had been waiting for this moment all along. Claire swallowed hard, one hand gripping the handle, the other resting on the dog's back for strength. Whatever was down there, they were about to find it. The basement had grown colder since the sun went down, the kind of damp chill that crept into Lila's bones no matter how tightly she hugged her knees. She sat against the wall, her small hands clutching the broken radio, though the battery had long since died. It was useless now, but she couldn't bring herself to let it go. It was the only thing that had given her hope, the only thing that made her feel like she wasn't completely forgotten. Her throat was raw from whispering into it for days, sending her words into nothing, praying someone out there would hear. She was drifting in and out of sleep when she heard it. A sound different from the usual creaks of the old shack, different from the heavy footsteps of the men who sometimes came down to check on her. It was sharper, quicker, like claws raking against wood. Her eyes flew open. She held her breath and listened. Again it came, closer this time, a desperate scraping above her head. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She crawled across the cold floor, pressing her ear to the boards. The scratching continued, steady and fierce, and with it came the faint sound of panting. Her lips trembled as she pressed them against the thin crack between the boards and whispered, her voice no stronger than a breeze, "Help me." For a moment, the room fell silent, and she feared she had only imagined the sound. But then, above her, something shifted. She could hear claws stop mid-scratch, could feel a pause, as if whatever was up there had frozen in place to listen. Her breath caught when it came, deep and low, a bark that vibrated through the wood and shook the air around her. It wasn't the bark of a man's dog chained to frighten her. It wasn't angry. It was powerful and certain, a sound that said, "I found you." Lila pressed her hands over her mouth to stop herself from sobbing too loud, but tears rolled down her dirty cheeks anyway. She whispered again, pushing her words into the crack as if she could force them through. "I'm here. Please, don't leave me." Above her the claws returned, faster now, raking and tearing at the boards. She could hear wood splintering, dust falling through the cracks and coating her hair. The sound filled her chest with warmth she hadn't felt in days. Whoever was up there wasn't walking away. Whoever was up there had heard her. She pressed her cheek flat to the floor and stretched her fingers through the gap, as if somehow they might reach the one digging for her. The growls above grew louder, joined by the sound of a woman's voice, muffled but urgent, calling to the dog. Lila didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. They were working together. They were here for her. For the first time since she had been dragged into the basement, she felt something that had nearly slipped away. She felt hope. Claire's flashlight beam trembled across the boards as she pulled at the trapdoor handle with all her strength. The wood creaked, dust rising into the air, but the door would not give. When she wiped her hand across the seam, she felt the cold bite of metal. A steel plate had been fastened under the wood, sealing it tight. Her stomach dropped. Whoever had put this in place had known exactly what they were doing. She pulled harder, her breath coming in ragged bursts, but the lock held firm. Ranger wasn't willing to wait. He threw himself at the boards, teeth snapping, claws raking deep grooves into the wood. The sound filled the shack, loud and furious, like thunder contained in one room. Claire reached out to stop him, but the dog shook her off and came back harder, slamming his body against the door until the floor shuddered. His paws began to bleed from the splintered wood, but he never stopped. His growls were guttural, his eyes burning with the need to break through. Then, between the cracks, came the smallest sound. A voice, trembling but steady, floated up through the gap. "Please," the girl whispered, "I'm here." Ranger froze for half a heartbeat, ears pressed forward, his whole body quivering. Then he barked, low and strong, the kind of bark that rattled the boards and echoed in the empty woods. Claire dropped to her knees, pressing her mouth close to the floor. "Sweetheart, we hear you," she said, her voice shaking. "We're going to get you out. Hold on." The answer came in a soft reply, muffled by wood and steel, but it was enough. "Don't leave me," the girl whispered. Ranger pressed his nose into the crack, his breath fogging against the cold metal. The girl on the other side pressed her small hand against the same spot, skin to steel, separated by inches. The connection only made him wilder. He scratched harder, ignoring the blood on his paws, ignoring the pain. Every scrape of his claws was an answer to her voice. Every growl, a promise that he wasn't going anywhere. Claire fumbled with her radio, her voice sharp as she called for backup. Her words spilled out fast, giving location, urgency, every detail she could. Static answered, then the promise that help was on its way. But when she looked at Ranger, she knew he wasn't waiting for anyone. His whole body was locked on the child's voice, his muscles straining as he lunged at the boards again and again. "Easy, boy," Claire whispered, though her own hands were shaking as she tried once more to pry the lock. Sweat dripped into her eyes as she pulled, her knuckles raw. The girl whispered again, steady this time, like she knew her words were keeping him alive. "You can do it. Please don't stop." Ranger answered her not with words but with action. He bared his teeth and bit at the steel latch until sparks flashed against his muzzle. He snarled and pulled, his body trembling with fury and love, refusing to give up. Claire's eyes burned with tears as she watched him fight. Between the dog above and the girl below, there was a bond stronger than steel, and no lock would hold forever against it. The sound of boots crunching leaves outside cut through the frantic scratching and the hiss of Claire's radio. Ranger froze, his head jerking toward the door, his ears stiff with warning. Claire's blood ran cold. The kidnappers were back. She switched off her flashlight and crouched low, her hand gripping her weapon with white knuckles. The shack seemed to shrink around her, every shadow stretching long, every heartbeat loud. Below her the girl whimpered, the sound barely audible through the cracks in the floor, and Ranger growled, a low rumble that seemed to promise he would not let anyone touch her. The door swung open with a crash. 2 men stormed in, their flashlights slicing through the dark, the metal of their guns gleaming. One was tall and broad, with a thick beard. The other, younger, with restless hands that shook as he gripped his weapon. "Check the trap," the older one barked, his voice rough. The beam of his light swept across Claire, but before he could react, Ranger exploded from the floor like a bullet loosed from a gun. The shepherd lunged straight for him, teeth flashing white, and clamped down on his arm before the man could raise his weapon. The flashlight clattered to the floor, spinning wild beams across the walls as the man screamed, his voice cutting through the woods. Claire used the distraction to rise, her own gun leveled on the younger man. But Ranger gave her more time than she needed. The second man froze at the sight of his partner pinned against the wall, blood soaking through his sleeve, where Ranger's jaws locked like iron. The younger man lifted his gun, but his hands shook too much to aim. Claire's voice rang out, firm and steady. "Drop it!" The boy hesitated, his finger twitching on the trigger, but Ranger snarled so violently the sound shook the shack. The kid's eyes went wide. He bolted for the door, crashing into the frame as he fled into the night, his flashlight beam bouncing through the trees. The older man was not so lucky. He thrashed and kicked, slamming his shoulder against the wall, but Ranger held fast, his teeth buried deep, his growl vibrating through the man's bones. Claire stepped forward, her weapon steady, her voice sharp as a blade. "Don't move," she ordered. The man's eyes burned with hate, but his strength was draining fast. Ranger's grip did not waver, even as blood dripped onto the floorboards. Below, the girl whispered, her voice trembling but filled with sudden hope. "Is that a dog?" Claire's chest tightened, but she didn't take her eyes off the man struggling before her. "Yes, sweetheart," she called down softly. "And he's not leaving you." The man pinned against the wall let out a curse, sweat dripping down his forehead. He tried to lift his free hand toward his belt, but Claire pressed the barrel of her gun against his temple. "Don't even think about it," she said. The man froze, his chest heaving, the strength draining from his fight. Ranger gave one final growl and shook his head, forcing the man to cry out in pain. Then, as if satisfied, the shepherd released him and backed up to stand between Claire and the trapdoor. His muzzle stained with blood, his teeth still bared. The man slumped against the wall, clutching his ruined arm, eyes wide with fear. The shack was silent except for the man's labored breathing and the faint voice of the girl below. "He found me," she whispered, and Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, as though to answer her himself. The shack was filled with the sharp smell of blood and dust, the silence broken only by the ragged breath of the man pinned against the wall and the steady hum of Claire's radio. Backup was on the way. She had given the location, her voice calm though her pulse raced in her throat. But Ranger was not waiting for anyone. The moment the man sagged to the ground, clutching his ruined arm, the shepherd spun back toward the trapdoor, his body heaving with determination. He scratched furiously at the boards, claws tearing splinters free, growling with every strike, as though each one was a promise to the girl below. Claire tried to steady her breathing. She glanced down at Ranger's paws and saw the blood smearing the wood, his nails worn raw, but still he refused to stop. He pressed his muzzle against the seam and bit down hard on the steel latch. Sparks snapped in the dark as his teeth scraped the metal, the sound harsh and desperate. Claire's chest ached at the sight. "Hold on, boy," she whispered, though she knew he wouldn't. He wouldn't stop until he broke through. The man groaned on the floor, spitting curses, but Claire ignored him. She kept her weapon trained on him, with one hand while reaching for her radio with the other. "I need tools here now," she barked, her voice hard. "Steel cutting gear, crowbars, anything. We've got a child under this floor." The dispatcher's reply was sharp and clear. Units were on their way. But to Claire every second felt stretched thin. Every moment, another chance that the girl's weak voice would fade forever. Ranger bit again, pulling so hard his jaw trembled. His body braced against the floor. He ripped at the boards until chunks broke loose, his breath harsh and fast. Then, from below, came the faintest sound, a cough, small and weak, and then a voice. "I'm here," the girl whispered. Ranger froze, ears forward, his whole body locked in silence. Then he barked, deep and shaking the shack, his tail lashing. The sound gave Claire goosebumps. It was no longer just noise, it was communication. Within minutes, headlights cut through the trees outside, beams flashing across the walls. Officers burst in, weapons drawn, eyes sweeping the room. Claire gave quick orders, pointing to the wounded man and the trapdoor. The moment the men saw the steel, they dropped their rifles and pulled out crowbars and cutters. Ranger backed up only enough to let them through, pacing in circles, barking in bursts of urgency. The metal groaned as tools dug into the seams, wood cracking, steel screeching against steel. Ranger shoved his head forward between them, snarling and pawing, as if he could lend his own strength to the effort. Finally, with a sharp snap, the latch gave way. The boards lifted, the hinges shrieked, and a rush of damp, sour air filled the shack. The smell of concrete and mildew rolled upward, heavy with neglect. For a moment there was only silence. Then a hand appeared, small and trembling, pushing through the gap like a fragile sprout reaching for light. Ranger surged forward, pressing his nose against the hand, whining low in his throat. The girl sobbed, the sound catching in her chest. Claire dropped to her knees and reached down, her voice breaking as she whispered, "We've got you. You're safe now." The officers worked quickly, pulling the boards away piece by piece, until the opening in the floor was wide enough for a person to slip through. Claire leaned over the edge, her flashlight beam cutting through the dust and shadows, and she saw her at last. A thin girl crouched on the damp concrete, her face pale, her hair tangled, her eyes too wide for someone so young. For a moment, Claire couldn't move. Relief and sorrow tangled in her chest until she found her voice. "It's all right, sweetheart. We've got you. Take my hand." Lila blinked up into the light, her lips trembling. She had imagined this moment so many times in the dark, prayed for it into the broken radio. But now that it was real, it felt too big, too bright. Slowly, carefully, she reached upward, her small fingers brushing Claire's. The grip was fragile at first, then desperate, as though she feared it might slip away. Claire tightened her hold and gave a nod to the officers. With steady hands they pulled her free from the hole that had been her prison. The night air rushed over her as soon as she was lifted, clear, cool, and sharp, filled with the smell of pine and damp earth. Lila gasped, her lungs straining against the sudden freedom, her eyes darting upward to the endless stretch of stars. For days she had known nothing but the flicker of a single bulb, the walls pressing in, the silence suffocating her. Now the sky opened above her, vast and alive, and she stared in stunned wonder. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She was too full of everything to speak. Ranger moved forward, limping on sore paws, his muzzle flecked with blood, his chest heaving with exhaustion. Yet his eyes were locked on her, as though she were the only thing that mattered. Before anyone else could touch her, Lila stumbled to her knees and threw her arms around his neck. Her small body clung to him with a strength that surprised everyone. The dog pressed into her hold, his head resting against her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear. His nose dropped to her chest, and he pressed gently, as though checking to make sure her heart still beat steady beneath the thin fabric of her shirt. Claire watched with her own throat tight, blinking back tears she hadn't realized were there. Officers stood quietly, some lowering their heads, none daring to break the moment. Lila whispered something into Ranger's ear, words too soft to catch, but his tail moved weakly behind him, a slow wag that carried more meaning than any shout of victory. Blood still dripped from his torn paws, and his body trembled with the strain of everything he had done. But he stayed steady in her embrace. For the first time since she had vanished, Lila's shoulders loosened, her breath slowing, her face pressed into the rough fur of the one who had never stopped clawing toward her. Above them the stars gleamed, the silence of the basement broken forever. In its place was the sound of hope, of steady breathing, of a girl and a dog holding on to each other under the night sky. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where silence held weight and every word spoken carried power. Reporters waited outside, their cameras flashing as the suspects were led in, but inside the courtroom, all that mattered was the truth. The men sat at the defense table in chains, their faces pale and drawn, but behind their blank expressions lurked the shadows of what they had done. Claire sat near the front, her uniform pressed, her eyes sharp, but her hand never left the thick fur of the dog at her side. Ranger lay quietly at her feet, head lifted, amber eyes steady, ready for what was to come. Lila walked into the courtroom slowly, her small frame lost in the oversized sweater she wore. The gallery was packed, every bench filled with people who had followed the case since the night she was found. She kept her gaze forward, her steps careful, and when she reached the witness stand, she paused only long enough to press her hand against Ranger's head. His ears flicked, and he let out a soft breath, as though telling her she was safe. Only then did she climb into the chair. The prosecutor's voice was calm, gentle, guiding her through the questions. At first her answers were short, barely louder than whispers, but the courtroom was so quiet that every word carried. She spoke of the basement, of the way the men had locked her away, of the radio she had tried to use. Her voice trembled, and when it faltered, she looked down, her fingers curling into Ranger's fur. He nudged her wrist softly with his nose, a silent reminder, and she drew strength from it. When the defense tried to rattle her, throwing sharp questions meant to confuse, Ranger never moved from her side. His steady presence seemed to anchor her, pulling her back each time fear threatened to overwhelm her. At one point her eyes filled with tears, and her voice caught. But before the judge could intervene, Ranger pressed his head against her knee. She smiled weakly, wiped her eyes, and went on. Her words grew stronger, her sentences clearer, as if his quiet confidence was flowing into her. She told them everything she remembered, the smells, the sounds, the voices that drifted through the cracks. She spoke of the night the boards above her shook, of the claws she heard scraping, of the bark that had told her she was no longer alone. Her words painted a picture of shadows and fear, but also of the moment hope returned. By the time she finished, even the hardest faces in the courtroom looked shaken. The prosecutor thanked her and asked if she had anything else to say. Lila looked out at the jury, her hand still resting on Ranger's head. "I thought I was forgotten," she said softly. "But I wasn't. He didn't forget me. He never stopped." Her words hung in the air like a promise, and Ranger, as if to seal them, gave a quiet huff, his tail thumping once against the wooden floor. The men who had hidden in shadows could not hide anymore. The truth had been spoken, carried not just by a girl's trembling voice, but by the steady presence of a dog who had refused to give up. The weeks that followed moved like a blur, but the memory of that night in the shack and the day in court never left anyone who had been there. The town of Oak Ridge carried the weight of what had been uncovered, and though healing came slowly, it came all the same. Families who had once whispered in fear now walked with heads high, and the courthouse that had echoed with silence now echoed with victory. At the center of it all was a scarred German shepherd who had refused to give up when everyone else thought the signal was only noise. On a crisp morning in early spring, people gathered outside the police station. The mayor was there, the sheriff, teachers, families, and children clutching hand-painted signs. They were not there for a speech or a parade. They were there for Ranger. Covered by a white sheet against the brick wall of the station was the mural the town had commissioned, a tribute not just to a dog, but to the fight he had carried on his own bleeding paws. When the cover was pulled away, gasps rippled through the crowd. Painted larger than life was Ranger, standing tall with his ears perked, eyes sharp and full of fire. Around him were children holding hands, their faces bright with color and laughter. Above them stretched a sky of stars, and beneath, written in bold letters, were the words, "He heard the signal we could not. He gave the silent their voice." Applause broke out, cheers echoing down the street, but Ranger only tilted his head as if wondering what all the fuss was about. He sat calmly at Claire's side. Bandages gone now, though faint scars still marked his paws. His amber eyes watched the children running forward to pet him, his tail wagging slowly, as if he knew the day was not about the pain, but the promise that had come after. Lila moved through the crowd quietly, her steps measured, her small hand clutching the hem of her sweater. She had been staying with her aunt since the trial, her world still fragile, but today she had wanted to be here. She knelt beside Ranger, her hand resting gently on the thick fur of his neck. The noise of the crowd faded for her, until there was only the sound of his steady breathing. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, and whispered, "You didn't just hear me, Ranger. You saved me." The dog pressed his muzzle against her chest, the same way he had the night she first stepped into the open air. His tail brushed the ground once, soft and certain. Claire blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, standing just behind them, her hand resting over her heart. The mural would stay on that wall for years, long after the scars of the town faded. Children walking to school would look at it and know the story of the dog who had turned static into hope. And for Lila, every time she passed it, she would remember the night when silence broke, when claws on wood became a lifeline, and when one dog refused to stop listening until she was free. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you liked this story, show your support with a like, and join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.